My toxic sister ruined my wedding. Then took things so far the police had to step in and do this to our family. Growing up, the differences between Laura and me were like night and day. Where I was quiet, studious, and avoided conflict, Laura was loud, attention-seeking, and seemed to thrive on creating drama. In every room, she had to be the center of attention, commanding conversations, and inserting herself into every situation. Our parents, for reasons I never fully understood, encouraged this behavior. They rarely called her out, excusing her antics as part of her strong personality. For years, I learned to let her have her way. It wasn't worth fighting her over every slight or argument. Whenever I tried to assert myself, Laura had a way of flipping the narrative, making it seem like I was the unreasonable one. So I stopped trying. I kept my head down, focused on my studies, and found peace in avoiding her as much as possible. As we grew older, Laura's behavior escalated. She couldn't handle the idea of anyone else having the spotlight, especially me. If I achieved something, a promotion at work, a new project, or even a small personal milestone, Laura found a way to diminish it. She would shrug off my accomplishments as luck, make snide comments about my choices, or shift the conversation back to herself. The real strain in our relationship began when I started a family with Alex, my partner. Having children had always been a dream of ours, and when I became pregnant with twins, it felt like the universe was finally aligning in our favor. Alex and I were overjoyed, ready to embrace parenthood and the life we were building together. When we shared the news with the family, the response was mostly positive. My parents were thrilled about becoming grandparents, and even some of Lara's initial reactions seemed supportive. But beneath her smiles, there was something else, something colder. She didn't seem genuinely happy for me. As my pregnancy progressed, Lara's indifference turned into passive-aggressive judgment. She made frequent comments about my life choices, emphasizing how rushed everything seemed and questioning why Alex and I hadn't gotten married first. At family gatherings, she barely acknowledged my growing belly and avoided conversations about the babies entirely. It was as if my happiness offended her. When Lily and James were born, they became the center of my world. Alex and I poured every ounce of love and energy into raising them, relishing every milestone and sleepless night. For a while, Laura faded into the background of my life. She rarely visited, and when she did, her disinterest in the twins was glaringly obvious. Her remarks about parenthood were dismissive, framing my new life as something unremarkable and unworthy of celebration. Lara's attitude came to a head when Alex and I decided to get married. After years of focusing on building our family, we were ready to take the next step and make it official. The wedding was going to be a small, intimate ceremony with close friends and family, something meaningful rather than extravagant. Predictably, Laura found fault with our plans. She criticized the size of the guest list, questioned the timeline of our decision, and even made veiled comments about how tacky it was to have a wedding after having children. Her disdain was palpable, but I chose to ignore it. Despite her attitude, I still extended an olive branch. I included her in the bridal party, hoping to avoid unnecessary conflict. But deep down, I knew that Lara's presence was a risk. She was unpredictable, and her need for attention often came at the expense of others. On the day of the wedding, everything started beautifully. The ceremony was perfect. The venue, adorned with soft floral arrangements and golden light, felt like a fairy tale come to life. Alex and I exchanged vows surrounded by the people who mattered most to us. Even Lily and James played their roles perfectly as flower girl and ring bearer, earning smiles and laughter from the guests. The reception began with an air of joy and celebration. Guests mingled, drinks flowed, and the atmosphere was warm and festive. But as the evening progressed, the mood began to shift. Laura arrived late, her entrance anything but subtle. She wore a dress that, while not outright white, was close enough to draw a few raised eyebrows. Her demeanor was calculated. She moved from table to table, her laughter louder than necessary, her comments sharp and biting. She found ways to insert herself into every conversation, ensuring that the spotlight found its way to her. As the night went on, I could sense her restlessness. Laura wasn't content to play a supporting role. It was as though she were waiting for the perfect moment to make her move. That moment came during the toasts. As friends and family shared heartfelt speeches celebrating Alex and me, Laura decided to take the stage. Without warning, she rose from her seat and began speaking, her voice carrying over the crowd with ease. What started as a faux sincere acknowledgement of my accomplishments quickly spiraled into something darker. Laura used the opportunity to remind everyone that Alex and I had our twins out of wedlock, framing it as an oddity that deserved scrutiny rather than celebration. She cloaked her words in humor, but the undertone was biting. I felt the heat rise in my face as her words hung in the air, a mix of embarrassment and anger washing over me. The room grew quiet, the awkwardness palpable. Alex's expression was tight, and I could see the discomfort etched on the faces of our guests. Laura seemed satisfied as she sat back down, a smug smile playing on her lips. But the night wasn't over. I didn't know it then, but this was only the beginning. Laura wasn't done, and what she did next would unravel the evening completely, leading to a series of events that would ultimately involve the police. After Lara's attention-grabbing stunt during the toasts, the energy in the room shifted. What had been a joyous and celebratory atmosphere was now tinged with awkwardness and discomfort. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to acknowledge what had just happened or pretend it hadn't. I tried to move past it, determined not to let her ruin the evening Alex and I had worked so hard to create. The DJ announced the first dance, and for a while, I let myself get lost in the music and the warmth of Alex's arms. The twins joined us on the dance floor, giggling and twirling in their tiny outfits, and for a brief moment, it felt like everything was back on track. But Laura wasn't finished. As the evening progressed, she began to escalate her behavior in subtle but deliberate ways. She lingered near groups of guests, dropping pointed remarks about how the wedding was charming for something so rushed, or how some people didn't seem to care about tradition. Her comments were veiled enough to avoid direct confrontation, but sharp enough to plant seeds of doubt and unease among the guests. At one point, I overheard her speaking with a group of distant relatives, recounting how Alex and I had skipped steps in our relationship. She framed it as casual gossip, but the tone of her voice was dripping with judgment. It was exhausting. Every time I thought I could finally relax and enjoy the evening, there she was sowing chaos and negativity. Even Alex, who was usually unflappable, seemed increasingly tense as the night went on. But the breaking point came later in the evening, during the bouquet toss. The moment was supposed to be lighthearted and fun, a chance for the single women at the wedding to share in the excitement. As I stood with my back to the group, preparing to toss the bouquet, I noticed Laura pushing her way to the front of the crowd. Her expression was smug, and it was clear she was planning something. When I tossed the bouquet, it arced beautifully through the air, only for Laura to snatch it out of someone else's hands. The guests laughed nervously, unsure whether to cheer or cringe. Laura, holding the bouquet triumphantly, made a show of pretending to faint, as though catching it were the most dramatic event of the night. Her antics were met with scattered applause, but I could feel the tension in the room growing. Laura was turning what should have been a small, joyful moment into yet another opportunity to center herself. What happened next, however, took her behavior from irritating to outright unhinged. After her performance with the bouquet, Laura approached the microphone the DJ had been using to announce the events of the evening. Without asking for permission or even acknowledging the rest of the bridal party, she grabbed it and began to speak. The room fell silent as she launched into a bizarre rant. She started by addressing the bouquet toss, joking about how she was the real star of the night. But then her tone shifted. She began talking about marriage and tradition, weaving in thinly veiled jabs at Alex and me. Her words grew more cutting as she rambled, and soon it became clear that she wasn't just making passive-aggressive comments. She was actively attacking me. She referenced my decision to have children before marriage, calling it out of order, and implying that it somehow diminished the legitimacy of my family. The guests were stunned. Some looked visibly uncomfortable, while others whispered to one another in disbelief. I stood frozen, torn between confronting her and maintaining my composure. Alex, ever my protector, placed a hand on my arm, a silent reminder to stay calm. But Laura wasn't done. She ended her speech by suggesting that my children were lucky to even be included in the wedding since they were born, before anything was official. Her words were met with horrified silence. The final straw came when she tried to involve the twins directly, making a snide comment about how at least they're cute enough to distract from the circumstances. At that moment, something inside me snapped. I wasn't just angry, I was furious. Laura wasn't just embarrassing me. She was attacking my family, my children, and everything Alex and I had worked so hard to build. I marched toward the microphone, ready to take it back and put an end to her tirade. But before I could reach her, one of our cousins, who had clearly had enough of Lara's behavior, stepped in. He grabbed the microphone from her and calmly but firmly told her to sit down. The room erupted into nervous applause, and Laura, clearly flustered, retreated to her table. For a brief moment, it seemed like the worst was over. But Laura wasn't one to back down so easily. As the reception continued, her behavior became increasingly erratic. She drank heavily, ignoring the concerned looks from family members, and began causing small disruptions, knocking over glasses, laughing loudly at inappropriate moments, and attempting to drag reluctant guests onto the dance floor. The final escalation came when she attempted to leave the venue with the bouquet, loudly proclaiming that she deserved a prize for putting up with such a ridiculous wedding. When one of the staff members tried to stop her, explaining that the bouquet was meant to stay as part of the decor, Laura lashed out. The confrontation quickly spiraled out of control. Laura began shouting at the staff member, accusing them of ruining her night, and threatening to report them to the venue's management. Her voice grew louder and more aggressive, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. That's when Alex stepped in, calm but firm. He approached Laura and told her that she needed to leave. But instead of backing down, she turned on him, hurling insults and accusations that left everyone stunned. When the staff eventually called security to remove her from the premises, Lara's behavior reached its peak. She began screaming incoherently, knocking over chairs, and flailing as the security team escorted her outside. By the time the police arrived, called by the venue staff to de-escalate the situation, Laura was sitting on the curb outside, shouting about how she had been betrayed by her family. Inside, the guests tried to recover, but the damage had been done. The evening, once filled with joy and celebration, now felt tainted by the chaos Laura had unleashed. After the police escorted Laura away, a heavy silence settled over the venue. What had started as the happiest day of my life now felt overshadowed by the chaos she had unleashed. Guests whispered in hushed tones, their faces etched with shock and discomfort. Alex, ever the steady presence in my life, stayed by my side, his calm demeanor helping to ground me. The staff at the venue worked quickly to restore order, righting overturned chairs and clearing away the remnants of Lara's disruption. Despite their efficiency, the mood of the celebration had undeniably shifted. For a while, I simply stood in a daze, trying to process what had just happened. Lara's behavior had always been dramatic, but this was something else entirely. She hadn't just embarrassed me. She had turned what should have been a celebration of love and family into a spectacle of her bitterness and selfishness. My first instinct was to apologize to the guests. I found myself moving from table to table, thanking people for their understanding and assuring them that the situation was under control. Many of them offered kind words and encouragement, insisting that Lara's actions weren't a reflection of me or Alex. But even their reassurances couldn't erase the knot of frustration and embarrassment tightening in my chest. Meanwhile, the gossip began to spread. Lara's dramatic exit and the involvement of the police had given the guests plenty to talk about, and it didn't take long for snippets of her behavior to filter through the room. Some were shocked by her audacity. Others seemed unsurprised, citing her history of attention-seeking antics. One of our cousins, who had been sitting near Laura during the reception, pulled me aside to share what she had overheard. Apparently, Laura had been complaining about the wedding from the moment she arrived. She called it unimpressive and low budget, mocking everything from the floral arrangements to the guest list. She'd even gone so far as to claim that I was trying too hard to make it look perfect, when in her eyes it clearly wasn't. Hearing this hurt more than I expected. It wasn't just that she had ruined the evening, it was the sheer malice behind her actions. Laura hadn't come to celebrate. She had come to sabotage, to make herself the center of attention at any cost. The fallout from her behavior wasn't limited to the guests. My parents, who had been notably silent throughout the ordeal, finally approached me toward the end of the night. Their expressions were tight, a mixture of embarrassment and something else, something that looked suspiciously like defensiveness. Without explicitly saying it, they tried to downplay Lara's actions. They suggested that she had had too much to drink, or that she was going through a lot and wasn't herself. Their words felt hollow, an attempt to excuse her behavior rather than hold her accountable. I didn't have the energy to argue. Instead, I simply nodded and walked away, leaving them standing awkwardly near the buffet table. The reception limped to its conclusion, with a handful of guests staying to offer support while others quietly excused themselves. By the time Alex and I left the venue, the joy and excitement we had felt earlier in the day had been replaced by exhaustion and frustration. The following days brought a new wave of fallout. Word of Lara's antics spread quickly among family and friends, fueled in part by the presence of police at the reception. People called and messaged me constantly, offering sympathy, expressing disbelief, or fishing for details. Then there was Lara herself. I wasn't expecting her to reach out, but 3 days after the wedding, she sent me a long, rambling text message. In it, she alternated between defensiveness and blame, claiming that she had been misunderstood and accusing me of overreacting to her behavior. She even suggested that Alex and I had set her up to look bad, as though her actions had somehow been orchestrated by anyone other than herself. I didn't respond. There was nothing I could say that would make her understand the impact of what she had done. As the weeks passed, the distance between me and Lara grew wider. My parents continued to make excuses for her, insisting that she wasn't a bad person and that I should try to mend things. But I wasn't interested in reconciliation, not after everything she had done. Alex and I focused on moving forward, pouring our energy into our family and finding joy in the life we were building together. But even as we tried to leave the drama behind, the scars of that night lingered. The relationship with my parents became strained as well. Their refusal to acknowledge Lara's behavior, or their role in enabling it, created a rift that couldn't be ignored. Every time I spoke with them, I felt the weight of their disappointment, their subtle insinuations that I should have handled things differently or been more forgiving. It wasn't until months later that I realized just how deep the damage went. At a family gathering, one of my aunts pulled me aside and told me something that stopped me in my tracks. Apparently, Lara had been bad-mouthing me to anyone who would listen, spinning the events of the wedding into a story where she was the victim and I was the villain. Hearing this solidified something for me. Lara wasn't just toxic, she was dangerous. Her need for attention and validation came at the expense of everyone around her, and I couldn't allow her to have that kind of power over me or my family anymore. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let her or her behavior define my happiness. What happened at the wedding was painful, but it also gave me clarity. It showed me who Lara really was, who my parents had chosen to protect, and where my priorities needed to be. I began to set boundaries, limiting contact with Lara and my parents while focusing on the people who truly supported me. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The wedding may have been overshadowed by her antics, but it was also a turning point, a moment when I realized the importance of standing up for myself and protecting the life I had worked so hard to build. In the weeks following the wedding, the consequences of Lara's actions continued to ripple through the family. Relationships that had already been strained began to fray further, exposing cracks that had been papered over for years. At first, it seemed like everyone was eager to move on. My parents, true to form, avoided any real confrontation, instead opting to downplay the entire incident. They spoke about Lara's behavior as though it were a minor embarrassment rather than a full-scale disaster, brushing aside any mention of the police involvement or the chaos she had caused. But not everyone was so willing to let it go. Some of the guests from the wedding, especially those who had been directly affected by Lara's antics, began to share their stories. A distant cousin who had traveled hours to attend told me how Lara had made snide remarks about their outfit. A family friend recounted how she had tried to commandeer their seat at the reception, claiming she deserved a better view. It became clear that Lara hadn't just been targeting me. She had been alienating almost everyone around her. Still, Lara showed no remorse. Instead of apologizing, she doubled down, spinning her own narrative about what had happened. According to her, the wedding had been a disaster long before she arrived, and her actions were simply an attempt to liven things up. She claimed that the police had been unnecessary and accused Alex and me of overreacting to her harmless jokes. Her words might have been laughable if they weren't so infuriating. It was as though she existed in a completely different reality, one where her behavior was justified and everyone else was to blame. Then, one afternoon, I received a call that changed everything. It was from the venue where the wedding had been held. The manager, a kind and professional woman named Linda, wanted to follow up about an incident that had occurred during the reception. At first, I assumed she was referring to Lara's disruption, but as Linda continued, my heart sank. Apparently, after Lara had been escorted outside, she hadn't left immediately. Instead, she had caused further damage, knocking over decorations, tearing down floral arrangements, and even attempting to take a centerpiece as she yelled obscenities at the staff. The venue had filed a formal complaint with the police, and they were now pursuing restitution for the damages. I was mortified. I had known Lara's behavior was bad, but this was on another level. Not only had she disrupted the wedding, but she had actively destroyed property in her quest to center herself in the chaos. When I confronted my parents about the situation, their response was as disappointing as I had feared. They dismissed the damages as overblown and claimed the venue staff had probably exaggerated what had happened. Worse, they tried to shift the blame onto me, suggesting that if I had been more accommodating to Lara, none of this would have happened. Their refusal to hold her accountable was the final straw. Determined to protect my family and myself from further harm, I took the necessary steps to separate from the toxicity. I contacted a lawyer to ensure that Alex and I wouldn't be held financially responsible for the damages Lara had caused. The venue manager, sympathetic to our situation, agreed to focus their claim directly on Lara, and I provided them with her contact information. But it wasn't just about the legalities. I realized that if I didn't take a stand now, Lara's behavior, and my parents' enabling of it, would continue to cast a shadow over every milestone in my life. I decided to go no contact with Lara. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was a necessary one. For years, I had tolerated her antics, excused her behavior, and hoped that she would change. But the wedding had shown me that she wasn't interested in growth or accountability. She was only interested in herself. The backlash from my decision was swift. My parents were furious, accusing me of abandoning the family and overreacting to a single event. They pleaded with me to reconsider, insisting that Lara wasn't perfect but still deserved forgiveness. I refused. For the first time, I felt a sense of clarity and empowerment. By cutting ties with Lara, I wasn't just protecting myself. I was setting a boundary that had been missing for far too long. But just as I began to feel a sense of peace, a new complication arose. One evening, while sorting through a pile of mail, I came across an envelope addressed to me in a handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a typed letter, a bizarre, rambling message filled with accusations and veiled threats. The letter claimed that I had ruined Lara's reputation by allowing the police to get involved at the wedding. It accused me of turning the family against her and warned that there would be consequences if I didn't retract my complaints about her behavior. My stomach churned as I read the letter. It wasn't signed, but the tone and phrasing left little doubt in my mind. It had come from Lara. The audacity of it all was staggering. After everything she had done, she still saw herself as the victim, painting me as the villain in her twisted narrative. At first, I considered ignoring the letter, chalking it up to another one of her desperate attempts to gain control. But as I reread it, a sense of unease crept over me. There was something darker about this message, something that made it impossible to dismiss entirely. I showed the letter to Alex, who immediately suggested we contact the police. While the threats weren't explicit, the fact that Laura had gone to such lengths to intimidate me was alarming. The police agreed to open a case, treating the letter as part of the ongoing investigation into her actions at the wedding. It was a surreal experience, sitting in the station and recounting everything that had happened, from the toast to the bouquet to the destruction of the venue. As I left the station that day, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. On one hand, I was exhausted from the constant drama and conflict. On the other, I felt a sense of determination growing within me. This wasn't just about Laura anymore. It was about reclaiming my life from the toxicity and chaos she had brought into it. The letter from Laura was the final push I needed to solidify my decision to cut her out of my life for good. Her veiled threats and refusal to take responsibility weren't just frustrating, they were dangerous. After filing the letter with the ongoing police case, I made it clear to everyone, including my parents, that Laura was no longer welcome in my life. The fallout was swift. My parents begged me to reconsider, insisting that family ties should outweigh the drama. But their pleas rang hollow. For too long, they had enabled Lara's destructive behavior, and I refused to let their guilt trips drag me back into the chaos. The police investigation into Lara's behavior at the wedding moved forward. She was eventually fined for the damages at the venue, and while the legal repercussions weren't severe, they sent a clear message. Her actions had consequences. Months passed, and life without Lara's toxicity felt like a breath of fresh air. Alex and I focused on our family, pouring our energy into raising Lily and James and rebuilding the joy that Laura had tried to overshadow. With time, the sting of her betrayal began to fade, replaced by a sense of peace and clarity. My relationship with my parents remained strained, but I made peace with the distance. They had chosen to defend Lara's behavior instead of supporting me, and while I wished things were different, I knew I couldn't change their priorities. The wedding, chaotic as it had been, became a turning point in my life. It taught me the value of boundaries and the importance of protecting my happiness, even if it meant making difficult choices. Laura may have tried to steal the spotlight, but in the end, she only illuminated the strength I didn't realize I had.